Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, there is a truth as old as time, yet we often forget it in the noise of life. It is better to walk alone with God than to walk with the wrong crowd headed nowhere. Many people today are so desperate for companionship, so fearful of loneliness, that they will cling to anyone who gives them attention. But not all company is good company. Not every hand that reaches out is meant to guide you. Some are there to hold you back. Some are sent to distract you, to pull you away from the narrow path that leads to life. The Word of God tells us in Psalm 1, "Blessed is the man who walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly." Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is to walk away. Walk away from those who have no respect for your values. Walk away from those who constantly drain your spirit. Walk away from those who tempt you to compromise your faith, your integrity, and your destiny. Yes, it is hard to be alone. It can be lonely, but being alone does not mean you are without purpose. In fact, some of God's greatest work is done in solitude. Moses spent 40 years alone in the desert before God called him from the burning bush. Jesus himself often withdrew to lonely places to pray. It was in solitude that they received their greatest revelation. God does not isolate you to punish you. He sets you apart to prepare you. If you are walking through a season of loneliness today, do not despair. God may be protecting you. He may be keeping you from relationships that would harm you. He may be calling you to himself so you can learn to depend on him fully. Better to be in the desert with God than in the palace with those who have no heart for him. Some of you are holding on to relationships that are not bearing good fruit. Friendships that only lead you into gossip, bitterness, and sin. Partnerships that compromise your values. If that's you, it's time to let go. You cannot soar like an eagle while holding hands with chickens. You were made for higher places. You were made to rise. And hear me when I say this. There is a difference between being alone and being lonely. Being alone with God is a place of strength, of renewal, of preparation. Loneliness is a feeling, but it is not a fact. You are never truly alone if God is with you. The wrong people will delay your destiny. They will cloud your vision. They will steal your peace. But when you trust God to be your closest companion, you'll find a peace that passes understanding. You don't need a crowd to be fulfilled. You need purpose, you need truth, you need God. So stand firm. Walk alone if you must, but know you walk with angels. Be willing to lose people if it means finding peace. Be willing to be set apart if it means walking closer to God. And remember, it's better to stand alone in truth than to be surrounded by lies. It's better to wait alone for the right people than to settle for the wrong ones. It's better to be alone with God than to be lost in a crowd without him. Loneliness with God is better than company without purpose. In a world that constantly pulls us in different directions, that truth becomes clearer with every passing day. People rush to fill their lives with noise, with crowds, with company, believing that being surrounded by others will ease the ache in their souls. But many have discovered, often through painful experience, that the wrong company can leave you more empty than being alone. Some crowds will cheer you on as you run headlong into destruction. Some companions will celebrate your downfall simply because they have no vision of their own. There are people who will stand beside you, but only to hold you back. There are those who will sit at your table not because they value your heart, but because they want what's in your hand. That kind of company will leave you drained, confused, and distant from God's purpose for your life. There is a sacredness to loneliness when it is spent in the presence of God. When you are alone, you are undistracted. Your heart can finally be still enough to listen. And it is in that stillness where God's voice can be heard most clearly. He does not always shout above the noise. Sometimes he waits for the quiet. Sometimes he waits for you to step away from the crowd, from the conversations that mean nothing, from the relationships that serve no purpose but to pull you farther from him. It is there in the silence of solitude that he speaks in a way that cuts through all the confusion and clutter you didn't even realize had filled your soul. Many people fear being alone because they mistake it for abandonment. But being alone with God is not abandonment. It's an invitation to come closer, to hear more clearly, to be strengthened in ways you never could be in the presence of the wrong people. There are seasons in life where God removes certain people, certain distractions, not because He wants to punish you, but because He wants to purify you. He wants to refine you, to remind you that your identity does not come from the crowd's approval, but from His presence. You can be in a room full of people and still feel utterly alone if you are not connected to the purpose God has placed inside of you. Being surrounded by those who have no intention of walking in the direction you are called to go can create a loneliness far deeper than solitude ever could. There is no fellowship in walking alongside those who are blind to where God is leading you. There is no peace in conversations that offer no wisdom, no encouragement, and no truth. Being in company without purpose is like standing in a crowd with no destination, no map, and no light to guide the way. You may be together, but you are all still lost. When God calls you apart, it can feel like a stripping away. Friends may walk away, opportunities may dry up, the phone may stop ringing, but in those moments when it's just you and God, He shows you who He really is and who you really are. He reveals things about your life, your calling, and your purpose that you never would have heard if you were still tangled in meaningless conversations with people who don't care where you are going. Some people in your life are comfortable with the old version of you, and as God begins to transform you, they no longer recognize the person you're becoming. That's why they pull back. That's why they no longer understand you. And that's why God sometimes allows the separation. It is not rejection, it is redirection. Being alone with God allows Him to show you the things you've been too busy to see. He shows you where you've settled for less than His best. He shows you the wounds you've tried to ignore but still need healing. He shows you the strength He's placed inside you, even when others have tried to convince you that you're weak. In solitude, you begin to understand that you are never truly alone. He is with you, closer than your next breath, speaking words of life over you while the world falls silent. And when you've spent time alone with God, you develop a peace that can't be shaken, no matter who leaves or who stays. You become grounded, no longer needing constant validation from those around you, because you've already heard the only voice that matters. His voice tells you that you are chosen, called, and loved. His voice gives you direction when everyone else offers confusion. His voice gives you courage to walk alone if you have to, knowing that He goes before you, walks beside you, and guards you from behind. It is better to be lonely with God than to have 1,000 people around you who cannot see the value of what He's doing in your life. It is better to wait in quietness for His timing than to rush ahead with a crowd that doesn't understand your destiny. People may not see the vision God gave you. They may not support the dream He placed in your heart. But if God is with you, that's all you need. In His presence, you find clarity. In His presence, you find strength. And in His presence, you are never truly alone. Absolutely. Here's an 800-word expansion of that keynote with no subheadings or conclusion, just a seamless flowing message. Wrong associations can delay your destiny. Sometimes it's not the obstacles in front of you or the hardships you face that slow you down, but the people walking beside you. The wrong people can become a weight you were never meant to carry, a distraction you were never meant to entertain, and if you're not careful, they can lead you down a road God never intended for you to travel. There is a path God has designed specifically for your life. It is marked with purpose, calling, and destiny. But if you link arms with people who aren't supposed to walk that road with you, they can pull you away from it, sometimes so subtly that you don't even realize it's happening until you've lost sight of where you were headed. Many people miss their moment not because they weren't gifted or called, but because they were connected to people who had no intention of growing, changing, or following God's direction. When you surround yourself with people who are content staying stuck, sooner or later, they will try to convince you to stay stuck with them. Not because they hate you, but because your movement convicts them. Your progress makes them uncomfortable. And if they're not ready to move forward, they'll do everything they can to hold you back. They'll plant seeds of doubt. They'll question your decision. They'll make you second guess the very thing God spoke clearly to you in private. And before long, you'll find yourself circling the same mountains, fighting the same battles, because you refuse to release the wrong associations. There are people who can delay what God is trying to do in your life, not because they have more power than God, nobody does, but because God gives us free will. And if you keep choosing the wrong people over the right path, you will miss doors that were meant for you. You will miss moments that were divinely appointed. The children of Israel were meant to step into the promised land in a matter of days, but because of wrong associations and wrong mindsets, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Some of them died, never having seen what God had promised them, not because God failed, but because they refused to separate from fear, unbelief, and rebellion. The wrong associations kept them circling, kept them wandering, and kept them from receiving what was already theirs. Some people are only meant to be in your life for a season, but if you try to make a seasonal relationship permanent, you will suffer. They were there to teach you something, to show you something, or to walk with you for a time, but not to stay. And if you hold on after God has told you to let go, their presence can become a burden instead of a blessing. They can take up space in your life that God intended for someone else, someone who is aligned with His will for you. You have to discern when it's time to release. Not everyone who starts with you is meant to finish with you, and it's not always obvious. Some wrong associations don't look wrong on the surface. They might say the right things, they might seem supportive, but deep down, their heart isn't for your future. They're comfortable as long as you stay where you are. They'll clap for you as long as you're not outgrowing them, but the moment you begin to rise, they shift. They become critical, distant, or discouraging. That's when you have to pay attention. That's when you have to choose. Do you slow down so they can keep up, or do you stay obedient to the pace God has set for your life? You can love people and still leave them behind. You can pray for them without walking beside them. You can wish them well without carrying their weight. It's not about arrogance, it's about obedience. When God calls you to move, you have to move. And sometimes that movement requires separation. Abraham had to leave his family and his familiar surroundings before God showed him the land of promise. Lot's association with Abraham brought strife and division, and eventually they had to part ways. And when they did, God spoke to Abraham again and gave him greater vision for his future. Some things God will not reveal until you release what's been holding you back. The wrong people will drain your energy, cloud your judgment, and cause you to question the clarity God has given you. They will convince you to settle for less than God's best because they have no intention of pursuing it themselves. They'll downplay your calling because they're not willing to pay the price for their own. And if you listen to them long enough, you'll find yourself settling too. You'll find yourself slowing down, dimming your light, compromising your values, just to maintain a connection that was never God's plan for you in the first place. The wrong associations can delay your destiny. They can keep you wandering in circles instead of moving forward into promise. God is calling you higher. He is calling you deeper, but not everyone can go where He's taking you. And that's okay. Some people are meant to be a chapter, not the whole story. Don't be afraid to turn the page. Don't be afraid to walk alone if it means staying in step with God. Your destiny is too important. Your purpose is too valuable. Don't let the wrong people cost you the future God has prepared for you. Separation brings revelation. There are moments in life when God pulls you away from the familiar, from people you've grown close to, from places that once felt comfortable. At first it may feel like rejection. It may feel like you're being stripped of everything and everyone you thought you needed. But what seems like separation is often divine positioning. God removes the distractions, the noise, and even the relationships that no longer serve His purpose in your life because He has something greater to reveal to you. And many times that revelation can only happen in isolation. Throughout Scripture, God has shown us this pattern again and again. Before He speaks deeply, before He reveals a new direction, before He releases greater purpose, He often brings a season of separation. It's not because He's punishing you or turning His back on you. It's because He wants your full attention. There are things He can only show you when you are no longer leaning on anyone else for comfort, approval, or direction. When God separates you, it is because He desires to be the one you rely on completely. He doesn't want you to depend on your own strength or the strength of others. He wants to teach you how to lean fully on Him. It's in those moments when the room grows quiet, when the phone stops ringing, when the people you thought would be there forever seem to fade away, that you are able to hear God's voice more clearly. He speaks in the stillness. He whispers in the solitude. It's there, in the silence, that He reveals truths that can't be heard over the noise of the crowd. Some of the greatest revelations are found in the wilderness, not in the center of the city. When God separated Moses from Egypt and led him into the desert, it was there, far from the palace, far from the people, where God revealed Himself in the burning bush. It was in isolation that Moses heard the call that would change his life and the lives of an entire nation. Separation is not just about pulling away from people. It's about pulling away from anything that clouds your vision or competes with God's voice. It's in those times when you have no one else to turn to that you finally turn fully to Him. You begin to pray differently. You listen more intently. You search for Him with a hunger you didn't have before. And God honors that hunger by revealing Himself in ways that transform you from the inside out. You come to know Him as provider because there's no one else left to provide. You come to know Him as comforter because no one else is there to comfort you. You come to know Him as friend because the people you thought were friends have gone silent. God is intentional in everything He does. When He calls you into a season of separation, it's because He's preparing you for something greater. He's refining you, stripping away the things that don't belong and making room for new understanding, new strength, and new vision. It's often in these seasons that you learn the most about who God is and who you are in Him. He reveals the parts of you that need healing. He exposes the lies you've believed and replaces them with His truth. He shows you what you're capable of when you walk in His power and not your own. We often think of separation as loss, but it's really an opportunity for alignment. God is aligning your heart with His. He's aligning your steps with His plan. And when the time is right, when you've received what you needed in the quiet place, He will release you back into relationships, opportunities, and assignments. But you'll be different. You'll be stronger. You'll have clarity. You'll be more confident in your identity because you found it in Him, not in the opinions or approval of people. There is something sacred about being set apart. When God separates you, He sanctifies you. He cleanses you from old ways of thinking and living. He renews your mind and fills you with His Spirit. It's a season of preparation for the revelation He's about to release. Sometimes we ask God for clarity, for answers, for deeper understanding, but we're unwilling to step away from the noise that's keeping us from hearing Him clearly. We want God to speak, but we're surrounded by voices that drown Him out. So in His mercy, God separates us. He brings us into a place where He can pour into us without distraction. And as hard as those seasons of separation can be, they are always followed by revelation. You begin to see things differently. You recognize God's hand in areas where you once felt abandoned. You understand why certain people had to leave and why certain doors had to close. The revelation that comes in separation often brings peace. Peace that surpasses understanding. Peace that helps you walk forward without fear or regret. God doesn't waste the seasons when you feel alone. He uses them to reveal more of himself to you, to show you his love in ways you never imagined, to deepen your trust in him, to prepare you for what's ahead. Separation brings revelation, and revelation brings transformation. And once God reveals himself to you in those quiet places, you will never be the same. Peace in solitude is better than chaos in companionship. There is something profoundly valuable about being alone, when that solitude carries with it the quiet calm of God's peace. Too often, people chase company for the sake of avoiding loneliness, only to find themselves entangled in relationships that disturb their spirit and steal their sense of peace. We live in a world that teaches us to fear being alone, to fill every quiet moment with noise, and to constantly surround ourselves with people. But the truth is, not all companionship is good. Not every crowd is healthy. And not every relationship is meant to bring you closer to where God is taking you. Some people confuse connection with purpose. Just because you're connected to someone doesn't mean they are part of your purpose. Many have found themselves in places of emotional and spiritual chaos simply because they chose company over peace. They chose to stay in conversations and relationships that disturbed their soul instead of embracing the stillness where God was waiting to meet them. The wrong companionship can bring unrest to your heart. It can create confusion in your mind. It can weigh down your spirit in ways you may not fully recognize until you step away from it. And by then you may realize just how long you have lived without the peace you once had. Peace is not something to be traded lightly. It is a gift from God that often comes when you have the courage to be alone rather than remain in the presence of people who bring nothing but strife. There are times when God will pull you into solitude, not as punishment, but as protection. He sees the chaos that certain relationships bring. He sees the way confusion clouds your thinking when you stay connected to people who don't carry his spirit. And so, in his mercy, he leads you away. He invites you into quiet places where your soul can rest and your heart can heal. There, in solitude, peace returns. You begin to remember who you are and whose you are. You begin to hear his voice again without interference or distraction. The world often sees solitude as emptiness. But in God's presence, solitude is full. It is full of clarity, full of healing, and full of peace that the world cannot give. Some people spend years trying to hold on to friendships or relationships that were never meant to last because they're afraid of being alone. They fear the quiet. They fear what it might reveal. But in doing so, they forfeit peace. They exchange the calm of solitude for the chaos of constant conflict, misunderstanding, and stress. And before long, they wonder why they feel so distant from God, why they are weary in their soul, and why they can't seem to find clarity about their future. There is no friendship or relationship worth sacrificing your God-given peace. The Bible tells us to guard our hearts, for out of it flow the issues of life. That guarding sometimes looks like choosing solitude over strife. It looks like stepping away from people who constantly stir up drama, confusion, and negativity. It looks like saying no to environments that disturb your spirit, even if it means standing alone for a season. Because in that quiet place, God does something holy. He restores, he strengthens, he gives you vision again. He replaces the noise of chaos with the stillness of his voice. And in that stillness, you find what you truly need. There is a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is an ache for connection. Solitude is an invitation into God's presence. You can be in solitude and still be completely filled, completely known, and completely loved. Because when you have peace with God, you are never truly alone. His presence becomes enough. His peace becomes your anchor. And you begin to understand why Jesus himself often withdrew from the crowds, not because he was avoiding people, but because he was seeking the Father. He knew the value of solitude. He knew that peace was not found in constant company, but in communion with God. Some people will never understand your decision to walk away from chaos in order to find peace. They may call you distant or detached. They may not understand why you no longer engage in the things you once did or entertain the conversations you once had. But you will know. You will know that your peace is priceless. You will know that your time alone with God is more valuable than any chaotic companionship the world offers. And in time, those who truly belong in your life will understand and respect that peace. They will bring their own peace with them, and together you will find companionship that does not compromise the calm God has given you. Peace in solitude is better than chaos in companionship. There is no comparison between the quiet assurance of God's presence and the exhausting noise of relationships that pull you away from Him. When you choose peace, you choose clarity. You choose rest. You choose the still waters that restore your soul. And in that place of restoration, God prepares you for what's next. He fills you with strength for the journey ahead. He gives you wisdom for the decisions you must make. And He surrounds you with His love in a way no human companionship ever could. Do not fear the quiet. Do not resist the seasons of solitude, for it is there that God breathes peace into your life, a peace that silences every storm, a peace that guards your heart and mind, a peace that prepares you for the life He has called you to live. God uses seasons of isolation to prepare you for your purpose. Often we think of isolation as something negative, a place of abandonment or loneliness. But in God's plan, isolation is not rejection, it's preparation. It's in these quiet, hidden seasons that God does some of His deepest and most transformative work within us. When He calls you apart, when He separates you from what's familiar and comfortable, it's because He sees what you're becoming, not just where you are right now. He's shaping you, refining you, and equipping you for the greater calling that lies ahead. Throughout the Bible, we see this truth played out over and over again. God's pattern has not changed. Before He elevates a person to walk in their destiny, He brings them through seasons of isolation. Think of Moses, who spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep before he was called to lead God's people out of Egypt. That time alone in the desert wasn't wasted time. It was necessary. It was a time of stripping away the pride of Egypt, a time of humbling, of learning how to lead by serving, of listening for the quiet voice of God in the solitude. Moses was not ready to carry the weight of leadership until he had first carried the silence of isolation. The same was true for Joseph. Betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, Joseph was taken far away from the people he loved. He found himself in Egypt, in a strange land, stripped of everything familiar. And yet God was with him. In the prison cell, forgotten by those he had helped, Joseph wasn't alone. God was preparing him. He was cultivating integrity, faithfulness, patience, and wisdom. The very skills and character that Joseph developed in isolation were the things that positioned him to stand before Pharaoh and interpret dreams. Without the prison, without the solitude, Joseph would not have been ready for the palace. Isolation with God is never a punishment. It's a classroom. It's a place where distractions are removed and your focus becomes sharper. In the quiet, God reveals things about yourself that you may have ignored in the busyness of life. He shows you where healing needs to happen. He exposes wrong motives. He purifies your heart and renews your mind. In the isolation, your dependence on Him deepens because there's nowhere else to turn. Your faith grows stronger because it's not propped up by the support of others, but rooted in a real and personal relationship with Him. David experienced this in his own life. Long before he stood before Goliath or ruled as king, David was alone in the fields tending sheep. It was there in isolation that he learned how to worship. It was there he discovered God as his refuge and strength. It was there he killed lions and bears, battles that prepared him for future victories on a much larger scale. No one saw those moments. They weren't public victories, but they were significant. God was preparing him, refining him, building him into a man after his own heart. And when the time came, David was ready because he had been faithful in the hidden place. God still works the same way today. He calls people apart so he can pour into them without interruption. He takes you through seasons when doors close, when relationships change, when the phone stops ringing, and when it feels like no one sees you. But God sees you. He knows exactly where you are, and he's doing something eternal inside of you. He's developing endurance, patience, and trust. He's strengthening your character so that when he opens the next door, you won't crumble under the weight of the calling. You'll be able to handle the blessing because you were faithful in the isolation. Seasons of isolation are often seasons of revelation. God speaks more clearly when you're not surrounded by the noise of other voices. You begin to hear his instructions in a new way. You receive vision for the next assignment. He begins to birth ideas, dreams, and strategies within you that you wouldn't have received if you were distracted by everything and everyone around you. He deposits something sacred in isolation that you'll carry into your public purpose. But this preparation isn't always comfortable. Isolation can feel like obscurity. It can feel like you're being overlooked or forgotten. You watch others move forward while you seem to stand still. But remember, God isn't delaying you, he's developing you. What he is doing in you now is preparing you for what he will do through you later. Don't despise the season of isolation. Embrace it. Lean into it. Learn what he's teaching you. Allow him to refine you. Jesus himself modeled this. Before he began his public ministry, he spent 40 days alone in the wilderness, fasting and praying. He was tested there, but he also received strength and clarity for the mission ahead. If Jesus needed that time apart to prepare for his purpose, how much more do we? Isolation isn't an indication that you've been forgotten. It's often a sign that you've been chosen for something greater. In these seasons, God becomes your source. He becomes your confidence. You are no longer relying on titles, positions, or people for validation. Your identity becomes rooted in who he says you are. And when you emerge from that time, you'll walk in a different level of authority. You'll carry a different kind of peace. You'll know that what you carry wasn't handed to you by man, but forged in the secret place with God. God uses seasons of isolation to prepare you for your purpose. And when the preparation is complete, when the time is right, he will release you into that purpose with power, with clarity, and with an anointing that could only be birthed in the quiet places where it was just you and him. May God bless you, strengthen you, and give you courage in your solitude. Amen.